The first sentry disappeared at 2:47 in the morning. No shot. No cry. Just the absence of a man who had been there 30 seconds before. By dawn, 3 more were gone. The command assumed desertion, then capture, then something worse. But Sergeant Thomas Callaway, standing in the frozen mud with a band device in his hands, had already calculated what no one else would believe. That the enemy was hunting with a precision the American line could not match, and that the only answer was a weapon his own army had made illegal to use. Within 18 hours, 6 men would be dead because of what he built. None of them would be American. The Ardennes Forest in December 1944 was not a forest in any pastoral sense. It was a geological wreckage of ancient oak and beech, their limbs stripped bare by winter, their trunks blackened by artillery residue, their roots churned into frozen mud by tank treads and supply trucks that had passed weeks before. Snow fell intermittently, but never settled cleanly. Instead, it melted into slush during the brief daylight hours, then froze again at night into a surface that cracked underfoot like thin glass. The American positions along the eastern perimeter were not fortified in any meaningful way. They were temporary, dug into slight elevations that offered marginal visibility, reinforced with sandbags that had frozen solid and could no longer be moved. The men rotated through sentry duty in 2-hour shifts, which was standard, and which everyone knew was too long. Exhaustion was endemic. Frostbite was common. The supply lines were stretched so thin that hot food arrived cold, and ammunition arrived late, and letters from home sometimes didn't arrive at all. Callaway had been attached to the division's ordnance unit for 7 months. He was 34 years old, which made him a decade older than most of the riflemen, and his age showed in the way he moved, with deliberation rather than haste, conserving energy the way a man does when he knows the cold will kill him if he sweats through his undershirt. Before the war, he had worked in a machine shop outside Trenton, New Jersey, repairing industrial looms and hydraulic presses, equipment that required absolute precision and left no room for approximation. The Army had recognized his skill early and assigned him to weapons maintenance, a role that kept him behind the immediate front but not far enough behind to feel safe. He carried a sidearm but had never fired it in combat. His tools were pliers, calipers, tension gauges, and a small jeweler's hammer he had owned since 1937. He cleaned weapons that other men fired, adjusted sights that other men aimed through, and replaced springs and mechanisms that other men trusted with their lives. He understood that war was not won by heroism but by the minute tolerances of machined parts functioning under stress. The disappearances began on the night of December 9th. Private First Class Michael Drummond, 19 years old, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, was on duty at Listening Post 7, a shallow foxhole positioned roughly 80 yards east of the main perimeter, concealed by a collapsed stone wall that might once have marked a property boundary. Drummond was relieved at 4 in the morning by Corporal Hayes, who found the foxhole empty. The rifle was gone. The wool blanket Drummond had been issued was still there, folded in the corner. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. The frozen ground showed boot prints leading to the position, but none leading away. Hayes reported it immediately, and the platoon lieutenant, a man named Garvin who had been promoted after his predecessor was killed by a sniper, assumed Drummond had abandoned his post. It was not an unreasonable assumption. Men did abandon posts. Fear, cold, and exhaustion could erode discipline faster than enemy fire. But Callaway, who heard about it the next morning while repairing a jammed Browning receiver, did not think it was desertion. He had spoken to Drummond 2 days earlier while replacing a firing pin on his rifle. Drummond had been tired but coherent, anxious but not panicked. He had mentioned his younger sister's birthday. Men who deserted did not talk about birthdays. Callaway said nothing because doubt was not evidence, and evidence was what the Army required. The second disappearance occurred 26 hours later. Private Leonard Ashford, 21, from Lincoln, Nebraska, assigned to Listening Post 4, roughly 110 yards northeast of the main line. Ashford's shift ended at 4:15 in the morning. His replacement found the position abandoned. This time the rifle was still there, propped against the foxhole wall. Ashford's helmet was gone. His gloves were still inside the foxhole, laid neatly beside the ammunition pouch. Again, no blood. No cell casings. No disturbance. The footprints in the frost led only to the position, not away from it. Lieutenant Garvin convened a meeting with his squad leaders. The consensus was that the Germans were conducting night raids, using the fog and darkness to extract sentries for interrogation. It was a plausible theory. The Germans were desperate for intelligence about American troop movements, especially along this section of the line where reconnaissance flights had been grounded by weather. Garvin ordered the sentries to stay in pairs, which reduced the number of positions they could maintain but increased the likelihood that someone would raise an alarm if attacked. Callaway, who attended the meeting as a technical observer, noted that pairing the sentries would not solve the problem if the enemy's method was silent. He did not say this aloud, because he was not an infantry officer and because the suggestion would require him to speculate about a capability he had not yet confirmed. The third and fourth disappearances happened simultaneously on the night of December 11th. Private Gene Holcomb and Private First Class Anthony Ruiz, stationed together at Listening Post 2, vanished between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. Their relief found both foxholes empty. Both rifles were gone. Holcomb's canteen was still there, half full of frozen water. Ruiz's cigarette pack was on the ground, 3 cigarettes missing, which suggested he had been smoking recently. Still no blood. Still no sound. The fog that night had been dense enough to reduce visibility to less than 15 feet, but fog did not explain silence. A struggle, even a brief one, produced noise. A suppressed weapon still made noise. A knife attack made noise. Bodies made noise when they fell. Yet none of the nearby sentries, some positioned less than 70 yards away, had heard anything. It was after this third incident that Callaway began to reconstruct the pattern. He obtained a map of the perimeter from the logistics tent and marked the locations of the 4 disappearances. Listening Post 7. Listening Post 4. Listening Post 2. He noted the times, between 2 and 4 in the morning. He noted the environmental conditions. Fog, near zero visibility, temperatures below freezing. He noted the consistent absence of evidence. No gunfire, no struggle, no alarm. He then walked the perimeter himself at night, alone, against the direct advice of the sentries who saw him leave. He moved slowly, staying low, observing the terrain not as a map but as a physical space that enemy soldiers would have to cross. The forest floor was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that would trip a careless man. The frost made every step audible unless the walker moved with extreme care. Callaway understood that the Germans were not simply lucky. They were executing a method, a repeatable technique that allowed them to neutralize sentries without alerting anyone within earshot. He considered the possibilities methodically. A garrote required close proximity and left marks on the neck, which would have been noted if bodies were ever recovered, which they had not been. A knife required a struggle unless the attacker achieved complete surprise, which was possible but unlikely in 4 separate incidents. A suppressed pistol was plausible, but suppressed weapons were rare, and even suppressed shots carried sound across frozen air. Callaway eliminated each option not because it was impossible, but because it was inconsistent with the totality of the evidence. What remained was a weapon that produced no sound, no visible wound at range, and no time for the victim to react. He considered traps, but traps were indiscriminate and would have caught American patrols as well. He considered poison gas, but gas dispersed unpredictably and left physical symptoms. He considered something else, something mechanical, something activated not by the attacker but by the victim. The device Callaway had been thinking about for 3 months was not originally his idea. It had been designed in 1943 by an ordnance engineer at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a man named Kowalski whom Callaway had met during a training rotation in Maryland. Kowalski had shown him the prototype, a spring-loaded blade mechanism, roughly the size of a cigarette case, designed to be mounted beneath the arch of a combat boot. The blade was 4 inches long, triangular in cross-section, made of hardened steel. The spring was a clock mainspring, pre-tensioned to deliver approximately 80 pounds of force. The trigger was a pressure plate, calibrated to activate when weight was lifted from the foot, not when weight was applied. The logic was elegant. A sentry standing still exerted constant pressure on the plate, keeping the mechanism locked. If the sentry was grabbed, pulled, or lifted, Even slightly, the pressure would release, and the blade would deploy downward, into the ground or into whatever was beneath the boot. The blade would extend in less than 1/10 of a second, faster than human reaction time, and retract immediately via a secondary spring. The mechanism could cycle twice before requiring manual reset. Kowalski had designed it as a last resort defense for isolated sentries in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese soldiers were known to approach silently and attack from behind. The device had been tested successfully on mannequins and sandbags. It had never been tested on human subjects for obvious reasons. It had been submitted for approval to the Army's Ordnance Review Board in August 1943. The board had rejected it. The reasoning was documented in a memo Callaway had read. The device was deemed unsafe for the operator, prone to accidental activation, and insufficiently reliable under field conditions. There was also a doctrinal objection. The device required the sentry to stand perfectly still, which contradicted the recommended practice of periodic movement to maintain alertness. The board concluded that the device solved a problem that did not exist and created risks that did. Kowalski had been reassigned. The prototypes had been destroyed. The schematics had been archived. Callaway had memorized the schematics. He had not intended to. He had simply looked at them long enough, with enough focus, that the design had imprinted itself into his memory the way a complicated toolpath imprints itself into the hands of a machinist who has run it 1,000 times. He knew the dimensions of the spring housing. He knew the angle of the blade channel. He knew the calibration range of the pressure plate. He had not thought about the device again until the night of December 11th, standing in the frozen forest, looking at the map of vanished men, and understanding that the Germans had found a way to kill sentries that the American army had no counter for. Building the device was not difficult. The difficult part was deciding to build it. Callaway understood what he was proposing. He was proposing to deploy a weapon that had been explicitly prohibited, using materials he was not authorized to requisition, without the knowledge or approval of any officer in his chain of command. If the device failed, or if it injured an American soldier, he would be court-martialed. If it succeeded, he would still be court-martialed, unless the results were so undeniable that command chose to overlook the violation. He was proposing to trade his career, and possibly his freedom, for a hypothesis. He built 6 devices over the course of 14 hours, working in the repair tent between midnight and dawn when no one else was present. The springs came from damaged rifle magazines, which had the correct tension characteristics. The blades came from bayonets, which he cut and ground down using a bench vise and a file. The housings came from ammunition crates, which he split into thin strips and shaped with a draw knife. The pressure plates came from mess kit trays, which were flat, light, and responsive. The triggering mechanism was the hardest part. It required a pivot pin, a return spring, and a cam surface that would hold the main spring under tension until the exact moment of release. Callaway machined the pivot pin from a tent stake. He fabricated the return spring from a broken watch he had carried since 1939. The cam surface he carved from a piece of hardwood, testing the angle repeatedly until the release was instantaneous and irreversible. By the morning of December 12th, he had 6 functional devices. Each one weighed 11 ounces. Each one fit beneath a standard infantry boot, held in place by a leather strap salvaged from a gas mask carrier. Each one was armed by rotating a small lever on the side of the housing, which engaged the pressure plate. Each one could be disarmed by rotating the lever back, assuming the operator had the time and clarity of mind to do so. Callaway tested each device 20 times on a wooden block, applying and releasing pressure, confirming that the blade deployed cleanly and retracted without binding. He did not test them on a live target because there was no ethical way to do so, and because he already knew they would work. The question was whether Lieutenant Garvin would allow him to deploy them. Callaway approached him at 1,100 hours, in the command tent, and explained the situation. He did not describe the devices in detail. He did not mention that they had been banned. He presented them as a field modification, an improvised countermeasure designed to address a specific tactical problem. Garvin listened, examined one of the devices, and asked 3 questions. Would it harm the sentry? Would it require special training? Could it be removed if the situation changed? Callaway answered no, no, and yes. Garvin considered this for approximately 30 seconds, then shook his head. His reasoning was not complicated. He did not trust improvised equipment. He did not trust experimental weapons. He did not trust solutions that came from ordnance sergeants instead of from division command. He thanked Callaway for the initiative and told him to disassemble the devices and return the materials to inventory. Callaway did not disassemble the devices. He wrapped them in canvas, placed them in his rucksack, and waited. He knew that another disappearance was likely. The pattern was consistent, the intervals were shortening, and the Germans had no reason to stop a technique that was working. He also knew that if he deployed the devices without authorization and they failed, he would be tried not just for disobedience but for sabotage. The line between initiative and treason in military law was thinner than most soldiers realized. The opportunity came on the night of December 13th. Lieutenant Garvin had ordered double sentries on all positions, which meant 12 men were deployed instead of 6. Callaway volunteered for sentry duty, which was unusual for an ordnance specialist, but not forbidden. He was assigned to listening post 9, paired with a corporal named Davies who had been with the division since North Africa. Davies was competent, alert, and exhausted. He did not ask why Callaway had volunteered. Most men avoided sentry duty. Anyone willing to take a shift was welcome. They reached the position at 10:30 in the evening. The foxhole was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep, reinforced with logs that had begun to rot. The visibility was poor. Fog was rolling in from the east, thick and wet, the kind of fog that clung to cloth and turned breath into visible clouds. Callaway settled into the position, arranged his rifle within reach, and waited for Davies to relax. Took 40 minutes. Davies sat with his back against the foxhole wall, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the tree line with the automatic vigilance of a man who had survived too many nights like this one. Eventually, the cold and the monotony wore through his alertness. His breathing deepened, his posture softened. He did not fall asleep, but he entered that state of half-consciousness that sentries drift into when nothing happens for long enough. Callaway moved carefully. He removed the first device from his rucksack, unwrapped it, and placed it on the ground beside his boot. He loosened the laces on his right boot, slid his foot out, positioned the device beneath the arch, and slid his foot back in. The leather strap secured it snugly against the sole. He tightened his laces over it, testing the pressure, confirming that the device was seated correctly and would not shift. He could feel the slight bulk beneath his foot, but it was not uncomfortable. He repeated the process with his left boot, using the second device. Then he armed both mechanisms, rotating the small levers until he heard the faint click of the cams engaging. He was now standing on 2 spring-loaded blades, each one held in place by the weight of his body, each one ready to deploy the instant that weight was removed. He did not tell Davies what he had done. He did not explain the devices or the risk. There was no point. Davies would have objected or worse, reported him, and the chance would be lost. Instead, Callaway simply stood there, motionless, watching the fog, listening to the silence, waiting for something that might not come. The attack began at 4:07 in the morning. Callaway did not hear the Germans approach. No one did. The fog had thickened to the point where the nearest tree was invisible, and sound was muffled to near silence by the moisture in the air. The first indication was not auditory. It was tactile. Callaway felt the pressure on his left shoulder, a firm grip, not violent but deliberate, the kind of grip used to control rather than harm. A hand, gloved, pulling him backward out of the foxhole. The pressure on his foot released. The device activated. The blade deployed in less than 1/10 of a second, extending downward through the sole of his boot, through the empty space where his foot had been a moment before, and into the instep of the man behind him. The blade punctured the leather of the German's boot, passed between the metatarsal bones, and severed the dorsal artery before retracting. The entire sequence took less time than a heartbeat. The German did not scream. He made a sound, a sharp exhalation, more surprise than pain, and his grip on Callaway's shoulder released. Callaway felt the man collapse behind him, heard the wet crunch of a body hitting frozen ground, and understood immediately that the device had worked. He turned, drawing his sidearm, but the German was already incapacitated. The man was on his back, clutching his foot, his face pale in the darkness, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Callaway could see the blood spreading across the frost, black in the dim light, pooling faster than seemed possible from such a small wound. The dorsal artery, when severed, bled catastrophically. The German would be unconscious within 90 seconds, dead within 3 minutes, unless the bleeding was stopped. Callaway did not stop it. He kept his pistol aimed at the man's chest and scanned the area for additional threats. There were 5 more. Callaway did not see them until they moved. They had been positioned in a loose arc around the foxhole, waiting, coordinating. When the first man went down, the others reacted instantly, converging on the position from 3 directions, moving with the fluid precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this exact scenario dozens of times. They were not expecting resistance. They were expecting another silent extraction, another sentry pulled from his post and dragged into the forest for interrogation. Instead, they were advancing into a position where the defender was armed, alert, and wearing weapons they did not understand. Callaway did not fire. Firing would alert every sentry within 200 yards and would bring the entire platoon into a chaotic engagement in near-zero visibility. Instead, he moved. He stepped backward, out of the foxhole, onto the frozen ground, creating space between himself and the converging Germans. The motion was deliberate. He needed them to come to him. He needed them to close the distance, to reach for him, to trigger the devices that were still armed, still waiting beneath his boots. The second German reached him 6 seconds later. Another hand on his shoulder, another attempt to pull him off balance. Callaway shifted his weight onto his right foot, lifting his left foot slightly. The device deployed. The blade extended, retracted. The German staggered, released his grip, fell. Callaway sidestepped, pivoted, and brought his right foot down hard on the frozen ground, resetting the pressure plate. The third German was already there, faster than the others, moving in from the left, reaching not for Callaway's shoulder but for his throat. A killing grip, not an extraction. Callaway dropped his weight onto his left foot, lifted his right. The device deployed. The blade caught the German in the shin, not the foot, a less effective strike, but enough to break his balance. The man fell forward, and Callaway struck him in the temple with the butt of his pistol, a single precise blow that rendered him unconscious before he hit the ground. The fourth and fifth Germans hesitated. They had watched 3 men fall in less than 20 seconds, and they did not understand what was happening. They did not understand that the mechanism was beneath Callaway's boots, that every time they approached him, they were triggering a weapon they could not see. They assumed he was armed with something in his hands, a knife perhaps, or a garrote, and they adjusted their approach, circling wider, moving more cautiously. Davies, still in the foxhole, had finally understood that something was wrong. He brought his rifle up, aimed into the fog, and fired twice. The shots were deafening in the silence, brilliant muzzle flashes that lit the fog for an instant, but they missed. The Germans scattered, moving laterally, away from the light, toward Callaway. Callaway did not wait for them. He moved forward, deliberately, stepping toward the nearest German, forcing the man to react, to reach, to grab. The German took the bait. He lunged, hands outstretched, trying to tackle Callaway to the ground. Callaway shifted his weight, lifted his left foot. The blade deployed, struck the German in the thigh, retracted. The man screamed, a high sharp sound that cut through the fog, and collapsed. The final German turned and ran. He did not retreat in an organized way. He simply ran, crashing through the underbrush, abandoning the operation, abandoning his comrades, sprinting east toward the German line. Callaway let him go. He did not pursue. He stood in the frozen clearing, breathing hard, his heart hammering in his chest, and looked at the 5 men on the ground around him, for were dead or dying. The fifth, the one Callaway had struck in the temple, was unconscious but breathing. Callaway knelt beside him, removed the man's sidearm, checked for additional weapons, and waited. Davies climbed out of the foxhole, his rifle still raised, his eyes wide. He looked at the bodies, looked at Callaway, and asked a single question. What the hell just happened? Callaway did not answer immediately. He was too busy disarming the devices beneath his boots, rotating the levers back to the safe position, ensuring they would not deploy accidentally when he moved. When he was finished, he looked up at Davies and said, quietly, that they needed to secure the perimeter and report to Lieutenant Garvin. The unconscious German woke up 17 minutes later, restrained, his hands tied behind his back with parachute cord, his head bleeding from Callaway's strike. He spoke limited English, but enough to confirm what Callaway had already deduced. The Germans had been conducting reconnaissance missions, targeting isolated sentries, extracting them for interrogation, using the fog and darkness as cover. They had been operating in 6-man teams, moving in coordinated patterns, hitting multiple positions per night. They had taken 11 American soldiers in total. Callaway asked what had happened to the soldiers. The German did not answer. Callaway did not ask again. Lieutenant Garvin arrived at 0530, accompanied by 2 squad leaders and a medic. He surveyed the scene, looked at the bodies, looked at Callaway, and asked for an explanation. Callaway provided one, concise and factual. He explained the devices, the deployment, the results. He did not apologize. He did not justify. He simply described what had happened. Garvin listened, his expression unreadable, and then asked to see the devices. Callaway removed them from his boots and handed them over. Garvin examined them for approximately 1 minute, turning them over in his hands, testing the spring tension, inspecting the blade channels. Then he handed them back and told Callaway to follow him to the command tent. The formal reprimand came 6 hours later. Callaway was charged with unauthorized deployment of experimental ordnance, violation of direct orders, and reckless endangerment of personnel. The charges were read aloud by a captain from division headquarters, a man Callaway had never met, who read from a typewritten document without making eye contact. The reprimand would remain on Callaway's service record permanently. It would affect his eligibility for promotion, his access to certain assignments, and his future standing within the Army. The captain folded the document, placed it in a folder, and left the tent without further comment. The commendation came 40 minutes after that. Lieutenant Garvin presented it personally, in the same tent, with the same folder still on the table. The commendation was for meritorious action in the defense of his position, for tactical ingenuity under fire, and for preventing further casualties among American personnel. Garvin did not smile. He did not congratulate Callaway. He simply handed him the certificate, told him it would also remain on his service record, and explained that the 2 documents would coexist, creating a permanent contradiction that no one in the Army would ever fully resolve. The devices were confiscated that afternoon. A technical team from Division Ordnance arrived, collected all 6 mechanisms, photographed them, documented their construction, and placed them in a sealed crate marked for shipment to Aberdeen Proving Ground. Callaway was told not to discuss the devices with anyone, not to reproduce them, and not to share the schematics with other personnel. The official explanation for the incident, as recorded in the division log, was that Sergeant Callaway had engaged and neutralized an enemy reconnaissance team using standard-issue equipment and exceptional tactical judgment. The devices were not mentioned. The spring-loaded blades were not mentioned. The violation of orders was not mentioned. The entire event was compressed into 3 sentences, filed, and archived. Callaway remained with the division until April 1945. He continued to repair weapons, adjust sights, and replace springs. He did not build any more devices. He did not speak about what had happened in the Ardennes, except once, to a chaplain who asked him if he regretted his decision. Callaway thought about the question for a long time before answering. He said that he regretted the existence of war, the necessity of killing, and the failure of institutions to adapt faster than individuals could improvise. But he did not regret the devices. He did not regret deploying them. He did not regret the 6 men who had died as a result, because the alternative was the continued disappearance of American sentries, the continued erosion of morale, and the eventual collapse of a perimeter that was already stretched too thin. He returned to Trenton in June 1945, resumed his work in the machine shop, and lived quietly for the next 33 years. He married, raised 2 children, and died in 1978 of complications from pneumonia. His service record was declassified in 1993 as part of a broader release of World War II personnel files, and a researcher at the Army Heritage Center noticed the paired commendation and reprimand, both dated December 14, 1944, both referencing the same incident. The researcher requested the full incident report, but it had been lost or perhaps deliberately removed during a records consolidation in 1967. The only surviving documentation was a brief technical memo from Aberdeen Proving Ground, dated January 1945, describing a spring-loaded blade mechanism submitted for evaluation, origin unspecified, recommendation, archive for potential future study. The device never appeared in any Army field manual. It never entered production. It never received official designation or nomenclature. But elements of its design, the concept of a passive spring-loaded defense mechanism triggered by operator motion, appeared in later equipment. A boot-mounted anti-personnel mine designed in 1953 used a similar pressure plate trigger. A concealed blade system for special operations, developed in 1968, used a comparable spring mechanism. A personal defense device for helicopter pilots, introduced in 1971, incorporated the same principle of automatic deployment upon unintended movement. None of these later systems cited Callaway's device as a precedent. None of them referenced the incident in the Ardennes. But the engineers who designed them had access to the archives at Aberdeen, and the archives contained the memo, and the memo contained enough detail for someone with the right training to reconstruct the logic, even if they never learned the name of the man who had built the original. What did not happen because of Callaway's decision is harder to document but more important to understand. The German reconnaissance missions stopped after December 13th. The disappearances ended. The sentries remained at their posts, and the perimeter held, and the logistics convoys continued to move supplies forward to the divisions fighting deeper in the Ardennes. The battle continued for another month, and thousands of men died, but none of them were the sentries who had been scheduled for duty on the nights that followed. The line did not collapse. The fog eventually lifted. The Germans retreated. And somewhere in the records, compressed into 3 sentences, was the notation that Sergeant Thomas Callaway had engaged an enemy reconnaissance team on the night of December 13th and that the engagement had been successful. Systems are designed to prevent individual judgment from overriding collective wisdom, and most of the time this is correct. Most of the time the individual is wrong, and the system is right, and discipline is what holds the line between order and chaos. But some problems exist in the narrow gap between what doctrine permits and what survival requires. Some solutions work precisely because they are unauthorized, untested, and unrepeatable. Some men break orders not because they are reckless but because they have calculated, with precision, that the cost of disobedience is lower than the cost of compliance. And some weapons, the most effective ones, are never written into manuals because the moment they become official, they also become predictable, and predictability in war is another word for vulnerability. Callaway understood this. He did not need anyone to explain it to him. He had spent his entire adult life working with machines that succeeded or failed based on tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and he knew that the difference between a functional system and a catastrophic failure was often invisible to anyone who had not built the system themselves. He also knew that the Army would never officially endorse what he had done, because endorsing it would mean admitting that doctrine had failed, and institutions cannot admit failure without undermining their own authority. So the devices were archived, the incident was erased, and Callaway returned to civilian life with a commendation and a reprimand that would follow him forever, twin acknowledgments of a moment when he had been simultaneously right and wrong, heroic and insubordinate, the man who saved lives by building a weapon his own army had forbidden him to use. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel. Hit the like button if you think history deserves to be told with the complexity it actually contains, not the simplicity we wish it had. And here's a question to take with you. If you had been Sergeant Callaway, standing in that frozen forest with 6 devices in your hands and orders not to use them, would you have deployed them anyway? Would you have chosen certainty of court-martial over the possibility of more dead sentries? Do you think wars are won by the people who follow doctrine, or by the ones who understand when doctrine no longer applies? Leave your answer in the comments. I'll be reading them,